My sister smiled as the lawyer handed her the keys to my father's mansion, the documents to his company, and the portfolio that everyone in town believed was worth millions. Then she looked at me with the kind of pity that only greedy people mistake for kindness and watched as I was handed a single worn envelope containing an old brass key attached to a faded wooden tag. The room filled with whispers because everyone assumed my father had left me with nothing more than a forgotten piece of property that had no value. Even I wondered if the years I had spent standing beside him through every hardship had somehow meant less than my sister's carefully rehearsed smiles. What no one in that room realized was that my father had spent the last year of his life preparing for the moment greed would reveal everyone's true face. And by the time the truth finally came out, the same people who celebrated my humiliation would be begging for a second chance they would never receive. My name is Emma Carter. I am 31 years old, and everything I believed about family died long before my father was buried. If you had met us a few years earlier, you would have thought we were the kind of family people envied. My father, Richard Carter, had built Carter Construction from a tiny local business into one of the most respected companies in the county. His projects shaped entire neighborhoods, and his reputation for honesty earned him the respect of employees who had worked beside him for decades. He never flaunted his wealth, drove the same pickup truck for years, and believed a person's word was worth more than any contract. After my mother passed away when I was 13, he devoted every part of himself to raising my older sister Vanessa and me. He attended every school event, taught us that success meant nothing without integrity, and constantly reminded us that family should never become a competition. I believed every word because he lived by those principles every single day. Vanessa did too, at least until money found her. She was 3 years older than me, beautiful, confident, and naturally charming. She had a way of making people feel special while quietly convincing them to give her exactly what she wanted. When she married Kyle, the son of one of the wealthiest developers in the state, something inside her changed. Expensive vacations replaced family traditions. Luxury brands became her personality, and every conversation somehow turned into a comparison between her life and everyone else's. Dad noticed it long before I did. Whenever she spent more time talking about investment returns than family memories, I would catch him staring into his coffee with an expression that mixed sadness with disappointment. He never criticized her because he hoped she would eventually remember the values she had been raised with, but every visit seemed to push her further away. I stayed close to him, not because I expected anything in return, but because he had always been there for me. I worked as a physical therapist at the local hospital, and although my salary was modest compared to Vanessa's lifestyle, I loved knowing that every day I helped someone stand, walk, or smile again after believing they never would. Dad often said my work reminded him that real success wasn't measured by bank accounts, but by the lives we improved. Then one cold November morning, everything changed. He collapsed during a meeting at the office, and within 48 hours, our lives were turned upside down by 3 words no family is ever prepared to hear. Stage 4 cancer. The doctors were honest from the beginning. Treatment might slow the disease, but there would be no miracle. I remember sitting beside his hospital bed while the rain tapped against the window, trying to stay strong even though every part of me was falling apart. Dad reached over, squeezed my hand, and smiled with the same calm confidence he had carried through every challenge in his life. He told me not to waste whatever time we had left, feeling sorry for him because life had already given him more blessings than he ever dreamed possible. I promised him I would be there every step of the way, and I kept that promise. I rearranged my work schedule, spent countless nights sleeping in a chair beside his bed, drove him to every treatment, cooked every meal he could manage to eat, and watched the strongest man I had ever known slowly lose the strength to button his own shirt. Vanessa came when it was convenient. She always arrived wearing clothes that looked like they belonged on magazine covers, carrying expensive flowers that Dad never asked for, staying just long enough to take a few photographs, promised she would visit again soon, and leave before the difficult moments began. She blamed her busy schedule, her children, charity events, business dinners, and vacations that had already been booked months in advance. Dad never argued with her. He simply thanked her for coming, waited until her car disappeared down the driveway, and quietly asked me to help him back inside the house, where the silence always seemed louder after she left. I told myself she was doing the best she could, but deep inside, I knew something had changed between us that could never be repaired. Then, exactly 2 weeks before he died, Dad asked me to bring him an old wooden box from the attic, lock the bedroom door behind us, and said something that made my heart race, because I realized he had been planning for a day I wasn't ready to face. Dad placed the weathered wooden box on his lap and ran his fingers across the faded scratches on its surface, as though every mark carried a memory. For several seconds, he simply stared at it without speaking, and I could tell he was choosing his words carefully. Finally, he looked up at me and said that there were moments in life when the people closest to us revealed who they truly were, not because they wanted to, but because circumstances gave them the opportunity. He told me he had spent the past year watching everyone around him, paying attention to who visited, because they loved him, and who visited because they were afraid of missing out on what he might leave behind. I tried to interrupt, insisting that Vanessa still loved him, even if she struggled to show it. But he gently shook his head. There was no anger in his voice, only disappointment. He admitted that for years he had made excuses for her because she was his daughter, yet every excuse had become harder to believe than the last. He said he wasn't worried about dying anymore. He was worried about what would happen after he was gone, when money would replace love and greed would wear the mask of grief. Then he unlocked the box with a small, silver key he wore around his neck and removed a thick envelope sealed, with dark blue wax. Across the front, in his neat handwriting, were the words, "For Emma, but only when the time is right." I instinctively reached for it, but he pulled it back and smiled. "Not yet," he whispered. "If I give this to you now, you'll try to stop what's coming. And some lessons can only be learned." When people believe they've already won, my confusion only grew. I asked him what he meant, but instead of answering directly, he told me to trust him the way I always had. He made me promise that no matter how unfair things looked after his death, I wouldn't challenge his decisions, argue with the lawyer, or fight with Vanessa. He repeated that promise 3 different times until I finally agreed, even though I had no idea why he was asking. Then he handed me the old brass key attached to a faded wooden tag with the words "Lakeside Cabin" burned into it. I laughed softly because that cabin had been abandoned since a violent storm nearly destroyed it 15 years earlier. As children, Vanessa and I had spent summers there fishing with Dad, roasting marshmallows by the lake, and falling asleep to the sound of rain on the roof. But after the storm damaged the property, none of us had returned. I couldn't understand why he was giving me the key now. He closed my hand around it and said, "Never let anyone convince you something has no value just because it looks broken." Before I could ask another question, a knock came at the bedroom door. Vanessa walked in, carrying shopping bags and wearing a bright smile that disappeared the moment she noticed the box sitting beside Dad. Her eyes lingered on it for only a second before. 3 days after we buried my father, I walked into the office of his attorney feeling emotionally exhausted but convinced that whatever happened next, at least our family would honor the values he had spent his entire life teaching us. I couldn't have been more wrong. The conference room was already full when I arrived. Vanessa sat confidently beside Kyle, dressed in an elegant black suit that looked more appropriate for a business meeting than a gathering to remember our father. She greeted me with a smile that felt rehearsed, then immediately returned to whispering with Kyle while occasionally glancing toward the attorney's briefcase. It was obvious they weren't anxious about losing someone they loved. They were anxious to find out what they had inherited. Several of Dad's longtime advisors, his accountant, and 2 senior managers from Carter Construction were also present. Most of them gave me sympathetic smiles because they knew how much time I had spent caring for Dad during his illness. The attorney, Mr. Lawson, waited until everyone had taken a seat before opening a thick folder and explaining that my father had updated his estate plan only a few months before his death. Hearing those words made me smile for the first time in days because I remembered the promise Dad had made me keep. I didn't understand it, but I trusted him. The reading began with several charitable donations to local organizations that Dad had quietly supported for years. That sounded exactly like him. Then came the personal gifts. His classic car collection went to Vanessa. His investment portfolio, valued at several $1,000,000, also went to Vanessa. The family mansion overlooking the lake became Vanessa's property as well. Carter Construction, the company he had spent 40 years building from nothing, would transfer entirely into Vanessa's control under the supervision of the existing Executive board. Every sentence felt heavier than the one before it. The room remained silent, but I could feel people looking at me out of the corners of their eyes, waiting to see my reaction. My heart broke a little more with every page Mr. Lawson turned, yet I remembered my promise and forced myself to remain still. Then he reached the final page. To my younger daughter, Emma Carter, he read, pausing briefly, I leave sole ownership of the old lakeside cabin, property together with everything permanently attached to that land. That was it. One sentence, nothing else. The room fell completely silent before Kyle let out a quiet laugh he unsuccessfully tried to disguise as a cough. Vanessa lowered her eyes for a moment, then looked at me with an expression that almost resembled sympathy. Dad must have known how much you loved that place when we were kids, she said softly. Maybe you can restore it someday. Her words sounded kind, but I knew exactly what she meant. Everyone in that room knew the cabin had been abandoned for over a decade after severe storm damage. The roof had partially collapsed, the dock had washed away, and the nearest town was almost an hour's drive. It was practically worthless compared to everything she had received. One of the executives quietly cleared his throat and looked away. Clearly uncomfortable, another offered me an apologetic smile as though he couldn't believe Dad had made such an unfair decision. Even I struggled to understand it. Had I somehow misunderstood everything? Had the months I spent sleeping beside his hospital bed, driving him to treatments, cooking his meals, and caring for him meant so little? Questions raced through my mind, but I never spoke them aloud because I had made a promise. Mr. Lawson closed the file and looked directly at me for a brief moment. There was something unusual in his expression, almost as if he expected me to say something, but when I simply nodded, he gave the slightest nod in return before declaring the meeting finished. People slowly stood and began leaving the room. Several former employees quietly hugged me and offered condolences, while others shook Vanessa's hand and congratulated her on becoming the new owner of the company. I watched as Kyle accepted every congratulations with a smile far wider than grief should ever allow. As I reached the parking lot, Vanessa hurried after me. Emma, don't be upset, she said, placing a hand on my shoulder. I'll make sure you're taken care of. If the cabin becomes too much work, Kyle and I might even buy it from you. Honestly, it isn't worth much, but we'd hate to see you struggle. I looked at the brass key resting in my palm and remembered Dad's final words, never let anyone convince you something has no value just because it looks broken. For the first time since the reading, those words echoed differently in my mind. Before I could answer, Mr. Lawson stepped out of the building and called my name. He walked over, making sure Vanessa and Kyle couldn't hear us. Your father asked me to give you something, he said quietly, reaching into his briefcase. My pulse quickened as he placed a small sealed envelope into my hands. Across the front, in my father's familiar handwriting, were the exact same words I had seen on the envelope inside the wooden box. For Emma, only after the will has been read. The moment I saw my father's handwriting, the noise from the parking lot seemed to disappear. My hands trembled as I stared at the sealed envelope. But before I could open it, Mr. Lawson gently placed his hand over mine. Your father gave me very specific instructions, he said in a calm voice. He asked me to tell you not to read this here. He wanted you to go to the lakeside cabin first. Once you're inside, and only once you're inside, you're to open the envelope and follow every instruction exactly as he wrote it. He trusted that you would understand why. Before I could ask another question, he reached into his briefcase again and handed me a small leather notebook. This belonged to your father. He carried it for years. He said it would only make sense after you read the letter. I looked at him in confusion, but he simply smiled and walked away without another word. Meanwhile, Vanessa had been watching us from across the parking lot. The moment she saw the envelope in my hand, her expression changed. The sympathy disappeared, replaced by curiosity. She quickly walked over and asked what Mr. Lawson had given me. I instinctively slipped the envelope into my handbag and told her it was nothing important. Just some personal papers Dad wanted me to have. She forced a smile, but I could tell she didn't believe me. Kyle stepped closer and casually asked if the papers had anything to do with the business or the estate. When I shook my head, he exchanged a brief glance with Vanessa before telling me that if I ever needed financial help with the cabin, they would be happy to take that burden off my hands. I thanked them politely, got into my car, and drove away before they could ask another question. Instead of going home, I found myself parked outside the cemetery. I sat there for nearly an hour, staring at my father's grave, wondering why he had chosen such a complicated way to leave me whatever he wanted me to have. Every part of me wanted to tear open the envelope immediately, but I had promised to follow his instructions. As the sun began to set, I finally turned the car toward the old lakeside road. It had been nearly 15 years since I had last visited the cabin. Nature had slowly reclaimed the narrow dirt path leading to the property. Tall grass brushed against my car, tree branches hung low over the road, and the wooden sign Dad had built when we were children lay broken beside the entrance. When I finally reached the cabin, my heart sank. Time had been even crueler than I remembered. The roof sagged in several places, paint peeled from the walls, windows were covered in dirt, and the front porch leaned dangerously to one side. Anyone looking at it would have seen exactly what Vanessa saw, a worthless piece of forgotten land. I stood there for a long moment, remembering summers spent fishing with Dad, learning to paddle a canoe, and listening to him tell stories beside a crackling fire. Those memories were worth more than the building itself, but they certainly weren't worth the millions my sister had inherited. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the old front door with the brass key Dad had given me. To my surprise, the lock turned smoothly, as if someone had maintained it recently. The air inside smelled of old wood and dust, but everything was strangely neat. The furniture was covered with white sheets, yet there wasn't the thick layer of dirt I expected. It looked as though someone had quietly taken care of the place while pretending it had been abandoned. My heartbeat quickened. I remembered Mr. Lawson's instructions, reached into my bag, and carefully broke the seal on the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from my father. The first line alone brought tears to my eyes. My dear Emma, if you are reading this, then everything has happened exactly as I expected. I know you are probably hurt, confused, and wondering why I appeared to leave everything to your sister. Please believe me when I tell you that I have never forgotten the sacrifices you made for me. I simply needed everyone to show me who they truly were before I gave you the responsibility I knew only you could carry. I wiped away my tears and continued reading. Dad explained that greed had blinded certain members of the family years before his illness, and during the months he was dying, he quietly confirmed every fear he had about what would happen after he was gone. He wrote that true character is revealed when people believe no one is watching. Then, halfway through the letter, one sentence made my blood run cold. Before you leave this cabin, move the old stone fireplace and open the compartment hidden beneath it. Everything you need to know begins there. And Emma, whatever you find, do not tell Vanessa until the time is right. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the letter. Slowly, I looked toward the massive stone fireplace at the far end of the room, suddenly realizing that my father's greatest secret had been waiting beneath it all these years. I spent the rest of that evening inside the cabin reading every page my father had left behind. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that he hadn't simply planned an inheritance, he had designed a test. Every document was dated, signed, and carefully organized. There were copies of meeting notes, financial reports, emails, and handwritten observations that stretched back nearly 4 years. Dad had quietly documented every attempt Vanessa and Kyle made to pressure him into stepping away from Carter Construction. At first, their suggestions had sounded reasonable. They claimed they wanted to reduce his workload and modernize the company. But over time, those conversations became demands. Kyle repeatedly proposed taking out massive loans against company assets to fund luxury commercial developments, despite several financial advisors warning that the projects carried enormous risk. When Dad refused, Kyle became increasingly impatient, insisting that the old way of doing business was holding the company back. Dad never confronted them. Instead, he kept records of everything. One notebook contained dates and summaries of every meeting they attended together. Another included copies of emails in which Kyle attempted to persuade senior employees to support an early transfer of ownership. Dad had even written personal notes describing the expressions on Vanessa's face whenever conversations shifted from his health to his estate. Reading those pages was painful because they confirmed something I had tried so hard to deny. My father hadn't suspected greed. He had witnessed it. The final document in the stack was addressed directly to me. It explained that years earlier, after consulting with his attorney and financial advisors, he had quietly transferred nearly every valuable asset connected to Carter Construction into the Carter Family Trust. The business Vanessa inherited was real, but it relied entirely on equipment, land, warehouses, patents, and contracts owned by the trust. As long as the company's leadership acted responsibly, the trust would continue leasing those assets at almost no cost. But if anyone attempted to mortgage them, sell them, or use them for reckless investments, the leases would immediately terminate. My father had built a safeguard that protected the company from greed, while giving dishonest people enough freedom to expose themselves. He ended the letter with a sentence that stayed with me long after I finished reading. Never destroy people when the truth can defeat them on its own. The next morning, my phone rang before sunrise. It was Mr. Lawson. He told me the trustee wanted to meet me immediately. We met in a quiet conference room at his office where an elderly woman named Margaret Ellis introduced herself as the independent trustee my father had appointed years earlier. She explained that she had worked with Dad for almost a decade and knew every detail of his plan. She congratulated me for following his instructions without confronting Vanessa after the reading of the will. Then she slid a folder across the table. Inside were reports showing that less than 72 hours after becoming owner of Carter Construction, Kyle had already approached a bank, seeking a multi-million-dollar loan using company property as collateral. The request had been automatically rejected because the company didn't legally own the property. Instead, the bank had contacted the trust for confirmation, triggering the very protection Dad had anticipated. Margaret looked at me calmly and said, "Your father believed this would happen within the first month. He underestimated them. It happened within 3 days. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They hadn't even waited for the mourning period to end before trying to profit from the inheritance." Margaret explained that under the trust agreement, Kyle's actions had already violated the conditions required for continued access to trust assets. However, before taking formal action, she wanted my approval because I would officially become the controlling trustee at the end of the 30-day transition period. I asked whether we should act immediately, but she reminded me of my father's final instruction. He wanted the truth to reveal itself completely. If we intervene too soon, they'll blame everyone except themselves. I agreed, even though every instinct told me to expose them immediately. 2 days later, I received another phone call, this time from Vanessa. Her voice sounded completely different from the confident tone she had used after the will reading. She claimed there had been a misunderstanding with the bank and asked if we could meet for lunch. During the meal, she spent nearly an hour pretending she wanted to rebuild our relationship, apologizing for being distant over the years and insisting that Dad would have wanted us to stand together. For a brief moment, I almost believed her until she casually asked whether I'd found any documents at the cabin mentioning the Carter family trust. I looked directly into her eyes and calmly answered no. Her smile disappeared for only a fraction of a second before returning. The lunch ended with another offer to buy the cabin, this time for 3 times more than she had originally offered. That alone told me she knew the property was worth far more than she had admitted. Later that evening, Margaret called again with unexpected news. The board of directors had demanded an emergency meeting after discovering they could no longer authorize major company decisions without approval from the trust. Vanessa and Kyle had spent the entire afternoon arguing with accountants, attorneys, and bank officials, insisting there had to be some mistake. There wasn't. Dad had anticipated every move. As I stood on the porch of the old cabin watching the sun disappear behind the lake, I finally understood what he meant when he said some lessons could only be learned after people believed they had already won. My phone buzzed one last time before I went inside. It was a message from Kyle. It contained only one sentence. "We know you're hiding something, and we're coming to the cabin tomorrow." By the time the sun rose the following morning, I had already moved every document from the hidden compartment into a secure deposit box exactly as my father had instructed. In the final page of his letter, the cabin looked ordinary again, as though it had never hidden one of the greatest secrets my family had ever known. Around 10 o'clock, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. Vanessa and Kyle stepped out together, but they weren't alone. Behind them were 2 men in expensive suits, one of whom introduced himself as the attorney representing Carter Construction. Vanessa forced a smile as she walked toward me, pretending this was nothing more than a family visit. She hugged me awkwardly and said she had been worried about me, staying alone at the cabin. It was the first time in years she had shown me that much affection, and it felt completely artificial. After a few minutes of small talk, Kyle finally stopped pretending. He admitted that the company was facing unexpected legal complications and claimed they needed to review every document Dad might have left behind. I calmly asked why they believed those documents would be here. Kyle hesitated before explaining that several banks had refused to approve financing because ownership records didn't match the assets listed on the company's balance sheet. I simply shrugged and told them everything Dad left me had already been reviewed. They asked if they could search the cabin. I politely refused. Vanessa's patience disappeared almost instantly. She accused me of hiding something that belonged to the company and insisted that Dad would never have trusted me with. Important business matters. Before I could answer, another vehicle pulled into the driveway. Margaret Ellis stepped out alongside Mr. Lawson and two members of Carter Construction's board of directors. The expressions on Vanessa and Kyle's faces changed immediately. Margaret calmly introduced herself as trustee of the Carter Family Trust and requested that everyone gather inside the cabin because an important matter needed to be addressed. Once we were seated, she placed several legal documents on the table and explained that the trust had completed its review of recent financial activity. She confirmed that Kyle had attempted to secure millions of dollars in loans by using assets legally owned by the trust as collateral without authorization. Under the terms personally written by my father, that action constituted a material breach of the trust agreement, effective immediately. Every lease between the trust and Carter Construction had been terminated, and all trust-owned land, equipment, facilities, and intellectual property were being reclaimed. Kyle immediately objected, insisting he had acted in the company's best interests, but Margaret quietly slid copies of the signed agreements across the table. There was no argument left to make. Every signature belonged to him. Every violation had been documented. Vanessa stared silently at the paperwork, before looking at me with tears beginning to form in her eyes. She demanded to know whether I had known about the trust all along. I looked at her for a long moment before answering honestly. Dad wanted people to reveal themselves before I revealed the truth. Those words seemed to hit her, harder than any accusation could have. Mr. Lawson then opened one final envelope that had remained sealed until that day. It contained a letter my father had written to be read only if the trust's protection clauses were ever activated. His words filled the room with silence. He wrote that wealth had never been the greatest inheritance he wanted to leave his daughters. Character was, he explained that one daughter had stood beside him when there was nothing to gain except precious time together, while the other had become so focused on receiving an inheritance that she had forgotten she was losing her father. He wrote that the cabin represented patience, humility, and trust, while the company represented responsibility. Only someone who valued the first deserved the second. The final paragraph formally transferred permanent control of the Carter Family Trust and every asset it owned to me. That included the land beneath every company facility, the equipment, investment holdings, and voting control over the future of Carter Construction. Vanessa remained the owner of the corporate shell she had inherited, but without the trust's assets, it had almost no value. The board members then stood and unanimously requested that I become the new chairwoman of Carter Construction under a restructuring plan my father had approved months before his death. I accepted on one condition: every employee would keep their job, and no one would suffer because of the mistakes made by my family. The board agreed immediately. Kyle lowered his head, realizing everything he had chased had slipped away because of his own greed. Vanessa quietly asked if there was any way to undo what had happened. For the first time since Dad's death, I saw genuine regret in her eyes. I told her that I forgave her because carrying hatred would only dishonor the man who raised us, but forgiveness did not erase consequences. Some lessons could only be learned by living with the choices that created them. Months later, Carter Construction was thriving again. Employees often told me they felt my father's presence in every decision we made because we continued running the company according to the values he had built it on. I restored the old lakeside cabin instead of selling it, leaving the hidden compartment exactly where Dad had built it as a reminder that the greatest treasures are often the ones people overlook. Every Sunday evening, I sit on that porch, watching the sunset reflect across the water, where my father once taught two little girls how to fish. One daughter remembered those lessons. The other remembered only the fortune she thought she deserved. In the end, my father was right. Money can build houses, but only character can build a family. And when greed tears that family apart, the truth has a way of rebuilding justice all by itself.